Introduction: The Unorientable Space of Dialectical Materialism. In his About Our Revolution, Lenin mentions Napoleon as saying, "On s'engage Oedipus, on voit." Although it was never proved that Napoleon actually said or wrote these words, which can be freely translated as, "One jumps into the fray, and then one figures out what to do next," they certainly capture his spirit. But can we still afford this stance in our era, when jumping into the fray may also mean pressing the button, thereby launching a nuclear attack? Today is the time for thinking, and "on se retire pour mieux voir Oedipus, on attack" seems more appropriate than its Napoleonic opposite. To see, one has to withdraw and acquire a minimal distance. This holds not only for politics, but also for sex, not only for thinking about sex but for sex itself, which always relies on a minimal withdrawal, a withdrawal which is not a retreat into passivity but perhaps the most radical act of them all. The title of this book, Sex and the Failed Absolute, offers itself to two interconnected common readings. 1. When religion or any other belief in an absolute fails, unbridled hedonism imposes itself as a way to some kind of ersatz absolute, as was the case with Sade. 2. Because of the inconsistent nature of sexuality, its elevation into the new absolute necessarily fails. Let's take the case of the woman question. To use this old, totally inappropriate designation philosophically, it can be resolved neither through a new, post-patriarchal, symbolization of femininity nor through the elevation of woman into an entity which resists symbolization, into the indivisible remainder of the process of 1. 2. Sex and the Failed Absolute. Symbolization. This second path was taken by F. W. J. Schelling, who knew that one cannot derive an expression like woman from principles. What cannot be derived one should narrate. 1. Schelling's break out of the logical structure of reality, which can be presented as a notional system, into the real of primordial drives, where there is no deduction, one can only tell a story, i.e., his move from logos to mythos, is thus also an assertion of the feminine. Schelling extrapolated this line of thought to its extreme. His premise, or, rather, the premise that Peter Sloterdijk imputes to him, is that the female orgasm, this most ecstatic moment of sexual pleasure, as the ancient Greeks already knew, is the high point of human evolution. Sloterdijk even claims that its experience plays the role of providing the ontological proof of God. In it, we humans come into contact with the absolute. Schelling tried to break out of the idealist closed circle, bringing in matter, organism, life, development, so. He was attentive not only to the purely logical mind but also to what goes on in the bodily sphere, sexuality. With human evolution, bliss is not just the Aristotelian thought thinking itself, but also a body enjoying itself to the almost unbearable maximum. 2. Female orgasm as a new version of the ontological proof of God. Instead of dismissing this as a version of the obscurantist New Age speculation, which it is, we should undermine it from within. The description of intense sexual act as the experience of the highest and most intense unity of being is simply wrong. It obfuscates the dimension of failure, mediation, gap, antagonism even, which is constitutive of human sexuality. This minimal reflexivity that cuts from within every immediate orgasmic one is the topic of the present book. How can this be in a book focused on the most elementary big philosophical questions, the nature of reality, etc.? How can we do this without regressing into a pre-modern sexualized vision of the cosmos as the space of an eternal struggle between masculine and feminine principles, yin and yang, light and darkness? The main chapters will explore this paradox. At this introductory moment, it is enough to insist on the purely formal nature of the reflexivity we are talking about. In mathematics, the convoluted structure implied by such reflexivity is called unorientable. An unorientable surface is a surface, the MO bias strip and its derivations, the cross, cap and Klein bottle, on which there exists a closed path such that the directrix is reversed when moved around this path. On a such surface, there is no way to consistently defy any the notions of right or Introduction 3. Left, since anything that is slid on it will come back to its starting point as a mirror image. The phi-rst premise of the present book is that the theoretical space of dialectical materialism is exactly such a convoluted space, and that it is this convolution, this self-relating circular movement of falling back into oneself, which distinguishes dialectical materialism proper from other forms of pseudo-dialectical materialism which merely assert the nature of reality as an eternal struggle of opposites. The obvious counter-argument that arises here is, but why refer to dialectical materialism, why bring back to life this arguably most discredited orientation of 20th century philosophy, the orientation which is not only philosophically worthless and unproductive but also stands for state philosophy at its worst and served as the ideological instrument of monstrous political oppression? The phi-rst thing to note here is that, if we forget its ideological, political context and take the term dialectical materialism in its immediate meaning, it adequately captures the spontaneous philosophy of most modern scientists. A large majority of them are materialists who conceive reality in what is commonly perceived as a dialectical way. Reality is a dynamic process permanently in motion, a process in the course of which gradual contingent change culminates in sudden reversals and explosions of something new, etc. I am, of course, not following this path of trying to save the rational core of dialectical materialism from its Stalinist caricature. My opposition to Stalinist dialectical materialism is much more radical. Stalin enumerated 4 features of dialectical materialism. 3. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics does not regard nature as an accidental agglomeration of things, of phenomena, unconnected with, isolated from, and independent of each other, but as a connected and integral whole, in which things, phenomena, are organically connected with, dependent on, and determined by each other. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics holds that nature is not a state of rest and immobility, stagnation and immutability, but a state of continuous movement and change, of continuous renewal and development, where something is always arising and developing, and something always disintegrating and dying away. For sex and the failed absolute. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics does not regard the process of development as a simple process of growth, where quantitative changes do not lead to qualitative changes, but as a development in which the qualitative changes occur not gradually, but rapidly and abruptly, taking the form of a leap from one state to another. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics holds that internal contradictions are inherent in all things and phenomena of nature, for they all have their negative and positive sides, something dying away and something developing, and that the struggle between these opposites constitutes the internal content of the process of development. If we oppose to Stalin's dialectical materialism as a new version of general ontology, let's call it DM1, our dialectical materialism of a failed ontology, DM2, we can also contrast each of Stalin's 4 features with the 4 features of DM2. Contrary to DM1, which ascertains that everything is connected with everything else in a complex network of interrelations, DM2 starts with separation, cut, isolation. To get to the truth of a totality, one must phi-rst tear out, isolate, its key feature, and then view the whole from this unique partial standpoint. Truth is not balanced and objective, it is subjective, one-sided. Contrary to DM1, which emphasizes sudden leaps and violent, revolutionary changes, DM2 focuses on the function of delays and dead time in gestation. For structural reasons, leaps happen too early, as premature failed attempts, or too late, when everything is already decided. As Hegel put it, a change takes place when we notice that it has already taken place. Contrary to DM1, which emphasizes overall progress from lower to higher stages, DM2 perceives the overall situation as that of an unorientable structure. Progress is always localized, the overall picture is that of a circular movement of repetition, where what is today reactionary can appear tomorrow as the ultimate resort of radical change. Introduction 5. Contrary to DM1, which interprets antagonism as opposition, as the eternal struggle of opposites, DM2 conceives antagonism as the constitutive contradiction of an entity with itself. Things come to be out of their own impossibility. The external opposite that poses a threat to their stability is always the externalization of their immanent self, blockage and inconsistency. Another way to draw a line of distinction between DM1 and DM2 would be with regard to the notion of ontological parallax. Why parallax? The common definition of parallax is the apparent displacement of an object, the shift of its position against a background, caused by a change in observational position that provides a new line of sight. The philosophical twist to be added, of course, is that the observed difference is not simply subjective, is not due to the fact that the same object which exists out there is seen from two different stations, or points of view. It is rather that, as Hegel would have put it, subject and object are inherently mediated, so that an epistemological shift in the subject's point of view always reflects an ontological shift in the object itself. For as for the parallax of ontology, it is another name for what Heidegger called ontological difference. It designates the fact that, ultimately, the ontological dimension cannot be reduced to the ontic one. Ontic is the view of reality as a whole that we humans are part of. In this sense, today's cognitive sciences and evolutionary biology deploy how humanity, inclusive of its cognitive capacities which enabled the rise of cognitive and evolutionary sciences, gradually emerged out of the animal kingdom. A transcendental, ontological rejoinder to this explanation is that it is ultimately circular. It has to presuppose that the modern scientific approach to reality is already here, since it is only through its lens that reality appears as an object of scientific explanation. The scientific view of reality thus cannot really account for its own emergence, but, similarly, the transcendental, ontological approach cannot explain the fact of contingent external reality, so the gap between the two is irreducible. Does this mean that the duality of ontic and ontological is our last word, a fact beyond which we cannot reach? If these lines arouse the suspicion that our philosophical effort is focused on German idealism, we should shamelessly plead guilty. Everyone who has seen Hitchcock's Vertigo remembers the mysterious scene in the Sequoia Park where Madeline walks over to a redwood. Sex and the Failed Absolute. Cross-section of an over 8,000-year-old trunk showing its growth history by date, points to two circular lines close to the outer edge and says, "Here I was born and here I died." Later in the film, the spectator learns that the sublime Madeline is a fake. The murderous Gavin Elster dressed up Judy, a common girl, to look like Madeline, his wife whom he plans to kill. In a similar way, we can imagine a philosophy muse in front of a timeline of European history, pointing to two date markers close to each other and saying, "Here I was born and here I died." The Phi RST marker designates 1781, the publication date of Kant's Phi RST critique, and the second one 1831, the year of Hegel's death. In some sense, all of philosophy happened in these Phi FTY years. The vast development prior to it was just a preparation for the rise of the notion of the transcendental, and in the post-Hegelian development, philosophy returns in the guise of the common Judy, i.e., the vulgar 19th century empiricism. For Heidegger, H. Ohlderlin is the exception with regard to modern subjectivity, although he was part of the German idealist movement and the co-author, with Schelling and Hegel, of the oldest systematic program of German idealism, from 1796 to 1797. In his poetry he articulated a distance towards idealist subjectivity and gained a non-metaphysical insight into the essence of history and the alienation of our existence. For us, on the contrary, all four great German idealists, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, articulated this distance, i.e., they struggled with how to break out of the horizon of absolute subjectivity without regressing to pre-transcendental realism. But where does materialism, dialectical or not, enter here? Our wager is that the notion of unorientables enables us to answer the question, what is materialism? We should get rid of the link between materialism and any notion of matter in a substantial sense, like small chunks of dense stuff floating in the air. Today, we need materialism without matter, a purely formal materialism of waves, quanta, or whatever, which move in a dematerialized space. Recall the opening title sequence of Tim Burton's Batman, 1989. The camera is slowly circulating around curved metallic shapes whose rusty materiality is displayed in an almost palpable way. Then the camera gradually withdraws and we can see that the curved shapes were the fragments of the letters of the Phi LM's title, Batman. This is one of the paradigmatic procedures of postmodern hyper-realism, to make us see, or, rather, feel, the raw material imperfection of what we usually perceive as just. Introduction 7. A set of formal shapes, of letters, in this case. Another, imagined, this time, example, when a movie is produced by Universal, titles begin with the Earth's globe and the letters Universal circulating around it. The postmodern hyper-realist version would then approach this letter closer and closer so that, instead of relating to letter as formal elements, we would see them in their materiality, with scrubs and other traces of material imperfection, as in the classic scene from Lynch's Blue Velvet where the camera descends onto a beautiful green lawn and enters it into an extreme close-up, and we are suddenly confronted by the disgusting life of crawling insects and worms hidden beneath the idyllic surface. Is this materialism? No. Such an assertion of the impenetrable density of matter as the space of obscene vitality always turns out to lead to some kind of murky spiritualism which pervades this matter. In order to arrive at true materialism, the opposite move is to be enacted. In Joseph Rusnak's The 13th Floor, 1999, Hall, the Phi LM's hero, drives to a place in an unpopulated California desert and discovers there a point beyond which the world becomes a crude wireframe model, the proof that our reality is itself a simulation which was not perfectly actualized everywhere, so that we can stumble upon parts where the bare digital bones of its structure become visible, as in an unfinished painting. True materialism always implies such a disappearance of matter in a network of formal relations. So why call this materialism? Because, and here the notion of unorientables enters. This movement of abstract, immaterial should be conceived as totally contingent, aleatoric, inorganic, purposeless, and in this sense non-spiritual. We should not be afraid to even talk about the materialism of Platonic ideas, insofar as they just purposelessly stumble around and get entangled in unpredictable combinations. Ideas are stupid, a mind embodied in a material, living being is needed to combine them in a purposeful way. Materialism should be totally deprived of any sense of evolution, organic development, progressive orientation. The worst idealism is the one masked as evolutionary materialism, a vision of reality as an organic whole which gradually develops itself into more and more complex forms. The new breed of evolutionary optimists, Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, like to enumerate positive statistics. Never were so few people involved in wars as in the last decades. For the Phi RST time in human history, obesity is a greater problem than hunger. The average lifespan grew enormously. 8. Sex and the failed absolute. Over recent generations, poverty is shrinking even in the poorest African countries, etc., etc. These are, mostly, true, but one can easily see problems that emerge with such a procedure. If one compares the status of Jews in Western Europe and in the United States in the course of the last century, the progress is clear. Today Jews have their own state, antisemitism is illegal, but in between, the Holocaust happened. The parallel with the years prior to World War I could also be of some use here. Could we not say the same about those years? More than a half-century of, mostly, peace in Europe, explosive growth of productivity in education, democracy in more and more countries, the general feeling that the world was moving in the right direction, but then the brutal sobering with the millions of dead in World War I. Are we not in a parallel situation today, after half a century of relative peace and growing prosperity? Here a true dialectical analysis enters. It helps us to detect the growing subterranean tensions which will explode and cut short the continuity of progress. Unorientables belong to the domain of surfaces, which also means that dialectical materialism is a theory of twisted, curved surfaces. For dialectical materialism, depth is an effect of convoluted surface. The present book, an elaboration of the basic structures of unorientable surfaces, consists of 4 parts. Each part begins with a theorem which articulates a basic philosophical thesis. This thesis is then specified in a corollary which brings out its consequences. Finally, the part is concluded by a series of scholia, explanatory comments which apply the basic thesis to a singular, and sometimes contingent, topic. Theorem I outlines the fate of ontology in our era. With the new millennium, a whole series of new ontologies emerged on the public scene of philosophy as part of the anti-deconstructionist turn. All of them express the need for a breakout of deconstructionist endless self. Reflexive probing into a positive vision of what reality is, Deleuzian ontologies of multitudes and assemblages, Badiou's logics of the worlds emerging out of the multiplicity of being, new materialist ontologies of a plural quasi-animist universe. The present book rejects this new ontological temptation. It is an easy way to succumb to the charms of a new ontological edifice full of thriving multitudes. However, along with Alenka Zupin CIC and others, I persist in the failure of every ontology, a failure that echoes the thwarted character of reality itself. This thwarted character can be discerned in the irreducible parallax gap between the Introduction 9. Ontic and the transcendental dimension, the notion of reality as a whole of being and the notion of the transcendental horizon which always mediates our access to reality. Can we step behind this gap, to a more primordial dimension? Theorem 2 is the key moment of the book. In some sense, everything is decided in it since it provides the answer to the deadlock in which Theorem I culminates. Yes, one can step behind the parallax gap by way of redoubling it, by way of transposing it into the thing itself, and the terrain in which this redoubling takes place for us, humans, is that of sexuality. Sexuality as our privileged contact with the Absolute. Following Lacan, sexuality is here understood as a force of negativity which disrupts every ontological edifice, and sexual difference is understood as a pure difference which implies a convoluted space that eludes any binary form. This notion of sexual difference is elaborated through a close reading of Kant's antinomies of pure reason and the concomitant distinction between mathematical and dynamic sublime. By way of asserting the irreducibly antinomic character of reason, euthanasia of reason, Kant, unbeknownst to himself, sexualizes pure reason, contaminates it with sexual difference. Theorem 3, the longest part of the book, articulates the contours of this convoluted space in its 3 main forms, those of the MO bias strip, the cross, cap, and the Klein bottle, a triad which echoes the basic triad of Hegel's logic, being, essence, notion. 5. The MO bias strip renders the continuous passage of a concept into its opposite, being passes into nothingness, quantity into quality, etc. The cross, cap introduces a cut into this continuity, and this cut makes the relationship between the 2 opposites that of reflection. With the cross, cap, pure difference enters the stage, the difference between appearance and essence, a thing and its properties, cause and its effects, etc. With the Klein bottle, subjectivity enters. In it, the circle of reflexivity is brought to the absolute, the cause becomes nothing but an effect of its effects, etc. That's why the Klein bottle cannot be rendered in 3-dimensional space. 6. Theorem 4 recapitulates the basic philosophical motif of the book, that of the persistence of abstraction, of radical negativity which cannot be sublated into a subordinated moment of concrete totality, in its three figures: the excess of madness as a permanent ground of human reason, the excess of deadly sexual passion which poses a threat to any stable relationship, the excess of war which grounds the ethics of 10 sex, and the failed absolute communal life. This negativity is what assemblage theory, or any other form of realist ontology, cannot fully take into account, and it is also what introduces into an assemblage the irreducible dimension of subjectivity. These four theorems form a clear triad, pun intended. They stand for the four steps of the systematic confrontation with the basic ontological question. The preparatory step provides the description of the crack in the positive order of being, and of the way this crack is supplemented by the transcendental dimension. The phi-rst step deals with the circular move of redoubling the crack as our sole contact with the absolute, and it explains, with reference to Kant's antinomies of pure reason, why, for us, humans, the primordial form of this contact is sexual experience as an experience of failure. The second step outlines the topological structure of this convoluted redoubling of the crack as it appears in three progressive figures of unorientable surfaces. Finally, the third step tackles the notion of inhuman subject, which phi-ts the impersonal assemblage of things and processes. Each of the theorems is followed by a corollary which elaborates its see consequences or implications. Corollary 1 deals with self-reflexivity as the convoluted structure of subjectivity apropos of the topic of intellectual intuition in German idealism. It endeavors to formulate the specificity of Hegel's thought in contrast to Kant's transcendental idealism, as well as in contrast to Fichte's and Schelling's assertion of intellectual intuition as the immediate identity of subject and object. Corollary 2 focuses on the convoluted structure of sexualized time, a time in which we can again and again return to the starting point. After identifying such a circular temporality in the type of subjectivity implied by the universe of video games, it goes on to discern its more complex versions in some recent phi-LMS, from arrival to discovery. Corollary 3 elaborates the unorientable structure of quantum physics. It focuses on the difference that forever separates our reality from the virtual real of quantum waves, the difference which undermines every ontological edifice. A general, anti-ontological vision of reality that follows from this model of the Klein bottle is presented, a succession of paradoxical objects which materialize a lack, less than nothing, whose phi-rst formulation is den, Democritus's name for atom, 7 more than 1, but not yet 2, and the excess over every couple, every form of the two, which gives body to the impossible relationship between the two. Introduction 11. Corollary 4 offers a theologico-political reflection on the ethical implications of dialectical materialism by turning around the well-known anti-idealist motto hic Rhodus, hic Saltus, used, among others, by Hegel. Then marks the true dialectical, materialist motto should be ibi Rhodus, ibi Saltus. Act in such a way that your activity does not rely on any figure of the big other as its ontological guarantee. Even the most materialist orientation all too often relies on some big other supposed to register and legitimize our acts. How then would an activity look which no longer counts on it? The answer is deployed through the analysis of 4 works of art: Lillian Hellman's drama Children's Hour, the Danish crime movie Conspiracy of Faith, Wagner's music drama Parsifal, and another crime movie, Taylor Sheridan's Wind River. Each theorem and its concomitant corollary is then followed by a series of scholia, short interventions that spell out some of their singular implications. Scholium 1.1 articulates the difference between Kant's and Husserl's notions of the transcendental, as well as the difference between Husserl's phenomenological epoche and the Buddhist suspension of belief in substantial material reality. Scholium 1.2 brings out the parallactic nature of Hegel's philosophical edifice, clearly discernible in the fact that Hegel ultimately wrote just 2 books, Phenomenology of Spirit and Science of Logic, which cannot be reduced to a common denominator. Scholium 1.3 explains, apropos of the topic of fake news, how the transcendental approach in no way leads to the death of truth, to the relativism of multiple truths. At a level different from empirical facts, there is a truth grounded in concrete historical totality. After resuming Hegel's critique of Kant's notion of transcendental schematism, Scholium 2.1 describes how sexual desire itself can function only as schematized, i.e., how it is operative only through a fantasy frame. Scholium 2.2 brings out the MO bias, strip-like reversals that befall the notion of sexual contract in Me Too ideology and practice. Scholium 2.3 elaborates the vagaries of the notion of repetition in Hegel's thought. Scholium 2.4 deals with 7 deadly sins, focusing on the link between aesthesia and contemporary forms of depression. Scholium 3.1 illustrates the reversal that characterizes MO bias strip with a series of examples from the ethical domain, from the idea of biodegradable bullets to the dilemmas opened by the killing of Reinhard Heydrich in Prague in 1942. Scholium 3.2 uses Stephen King's The 12 Sex and the Failed Absolute Dark Tower to explain the redoubling of the MO bias strip in Cross, Cap, and the concomitant notion of suture. In a polemic with Ernesto Laclau's notion of hegemony, Scholium 3.3 elaborates the difference between hegemony through a master signifier which sutures an ideological phi eld and the notion of the part of no part, which sustains the crack in a social edify ce. Scholium 3.4 confronts my notion of world as the inside of the Klein bottle with Badiou's notion of world as a specify C phenomenal situation of being. In an admittedly risky move, Scholium 3.5 offers the contours of a quantum Platonism. Scholium 4.1 deals with Jean-Claude Milner's reading of the Lacanian couple of language and Lalang, with the special accent on the asymmetry of the two terms. It asserts the primacy of language over Lalang. Scholium 4.2 describes an act that differs from Badiou's event, Sergei Prokofiev's crazy decision to return to the Soviet Union. In 1936, the climactic year of the Stalinist purges. Apropos two key works of Samuel Beckett, Malone Dies and Catastrophe, Scholium 4.3 elaborates the notion of abstraction as an ethical act which enables the subject to subtract itself from the opportunist quagmire of concrete circumstances. A careful reader will notice how the structure of each of the book's 4 parts echoes, reproduces even, the basic ontological matrix promoted by the book. A theorem stands for the universal genus, a universal axiom, its corollary stands for its species, following Hegel's claim that, ultimately, every genus has only one species. This one species is in antagonism with its genus. There is imbalance between the genus and its species because there is no second species that would complement the phi RST1 so that the two would form a balanced whole. This lack of the second species is then phi led in by the multiplicity of contingent scholia. Asterisk. 2 concluding remarks. First, many passages in this book are paraphrased from my previous work, for the obvious reason that the present book is an attempt to provide the basic ontological frame of my entire work, as close as I will ever get to presenting a philosophical system, an answer to big question about reality, freedom, etc. Last but not least, I am well aware that this book may appear to some readers somehow stuck halfway, while it tries to break out of the Introduction 13. Transcendental vicious cycle. Its result is ultimately a negative one, i.e., it fails to deliver a new positive, realist vision of the universe. All it provides is a kind of empty space between the two, transcendental space and reality, a gesture thwarted in its own completion. Incidentally, a homologous reproach is often directed at my more directly political writings. I never provide the outlines of the act of emancipation centered on a positive idea, multitude, new grass, roots power, or whatever. To these kinds of reproaches, I can only plead guilty, with one proviso, of course, this thwarted identity is my vision of the real, it is the basic condition of our lives. Caught in the horizon of metaphysical expectations, my critics don't see that what they, perceive as an intermediate state of passage already is the final result they are looking for, or, to use the mathematical term used in this book, they constrain the unorientable surface into the horizon of orientable progress. However, the true enemy of the present book is not new realist visions but what one is tempted to call the final art of non-thinking, an art which more and more pervades our public space, wisdom instead of thinking proper, wisdom in the guise of one-liners intended to fascinate us with their fake depth. They no longer function as articulated propositions but more like images providing instant spiritual satisfaction. Dwayne Russell provided some elements of this depressing picture. 1. Word art is popular and seems to be the new kitsch. I checked and it is increasing in sales volume at high-end and low-end Walmart shops. The word art always comes as a piece of wisdom: enjoy what you have, sometimes in life, family is all that you need, and so on. 2. McDonald's restaurants now plaster their walls with these little pieces of wisdom. One of the most frequented chains in Toronto has on the second floor an entire wall dedicated to sometimes in life, and so on. 3. In the United States it is popular to curate large collections of quotations on social media walls, Facebook, Instagram, etc. What is most interesting is that Facebook has even made it, in the last few years, so that a user can write something using symbolic inscriptions and it will automatically convert it into a rectangular image. This 14. Sex and the failed absolute. Rendering of the symbolic as image is what is most essential about this ideology. 4. Entire cases of books are dedicated at popular book franchises to poetry. Inside are life lessons or wisdoms. One such popular author is named Rupi Kaur. Each page is a life lesson and in the background there is an image that conveys the message. These books are extremely popular and on the bestsellers list. I could go on. These are all examples, I think, of the triumph of the image over the symbolic whole. 8. Therein resides the ideological function of word art wisdoms. While word art presents itself as a safe haven, a retreat from the madness of capitalist hyper-activity, in reality it makes us the best participants in the game. We are taught to maintain the inner peace of not thinking. The task of thinking is not to simplify in this symbolic whole but to keep it open and render it operative in all its unsettling force, whatever the risks of this operation. Notes. 1 Peter Sloterdijk, Das Schelling Project, Frankfurt, Scherkamp 2016, p. 144, my translation. 2 C. Ibid. 3 C. www.marxist.org/reference/archive/stalin/works/1938/09.htm www.marxists.org/reference/ www.marxists.org/reference/archive/stalin/works/1938/09.htm www.marxists.org/reference/archive/stalin/works/1938/09.htm. For a more detailed exposition of this concept, see Slavoj Zizek, The Parallax View, Cambridge, Ma. MIT Press 2006. 5. For a more detailed explanation of the unorientables, see Theorem 3. It also goes without saying that the numerous examples we use, from ontology, psychoanalytic theory, and politics, to illustrate the triad of bias strip, cross, cap, and Klein-Bottle do not fit perfectly just one of the terms of this triad. Quilting point includes an aspect of the bias strip, signifier falls into its opposite, signify-ed, of the cross, cap, quilt as the impossible bridge between the two levels, and of the Klein bottle, quilting as the point of subjectivization. Class struggle includes an aspect of the MO bias strip. Continuing on the line of objective social relations brings us to social struggle, of the cross, cap, the cut of social antagonism, and of the Klein bottle, the inward turn of subjectivization. What one should focus on is how this triad enables us to grasp more clearly different aspects of one and the same phenomenon, class struggle, in this case. Introduction 15. 6. More precisely, there are three-dimensional Klein bottles used as teaching tools, but they self-intersect and you can only remove the intersection by adding a fourth dimension. 7. For an excellent explanation of the key role of Democritus and other Ionian materialists whose radicality was obfuscated by the later hegemonic tradition of Plato and Aristotle, see Cogent Caratani, Isonomia and the Origins of Philosophy, Durham, Duke University Press, 2017. 8. Dwayne Roussel, Toronto, Personal Communication.